the art of execution, if you will, is underrated. The fact is that the difference between really good executors and average executors is massive. I do a lot of speaking now on this subject, and I have a lot of data, actually, interestingly enough, to support it. And one of the things I cycle through quickly is I cycle through different industries. So, for example, I look at the airline industry, and I look at the airlines that were in existence in 1950. And then I point out to my audience that all these airlines were after the same customers. They bought the planes from the same people. They bought jet fuel from the same companies, same terminals, same airspace, everything. And then I cycle through 1950, 1960, 1970, go through. And of course, you know that there's all sorts of winners and losers during this whole period of time. And so I say, so what is the difference? Like, why does Delta Airlines still exist? And so when I'm speaking to people at the end of this first 15, 20 minutes of my talk, they're like, wow, I get it.
You're obviously super passionate about leadership development and execution. Like no question there. I'm curious for our listeners and for myself, how did that start? Like where did you come from as a child, and as you launched early in adulthood, what got you on this journey to develop this passion?
Yeah, so there was kind of a fork in the road, right? So when I grew up in rural Colorado. The whole world, or my little teeny world, if you will, was divided between the farmers and the ranchers. And I was on the farmer side because my dad manufactured farm equipment. And he had a decent business for a while, but farm policy changed in Washington, D.C., interest rates spiked, basically went bankrupt. I mean, he didn't officially went bankrupt, but the company went away. And at one point it was a pretty decent sized company. Meanwhile, my grandfather on my dad's side was in the coal business, but his coal mine was the wrong kind of coal that got replaced by coal in Wyoming. And so his business went out of business. So I'm kind of this accidental entrepreneur, Lee, because my two primary male role models growing up, both were entrepreneurs who actually in the end didn't do well. But I went off to college. I went to Stanford, and I was the thought of not being in business for myself never crossed my mind. I just always assumed that was going to be my career path. So that's what I did. Although I did work at McKinsey & Company between business school and undergraduate, I always knew I was going to be in business for myself. So I had this career, and then I was brought back to teach at Stanford, at the business school at Stanford, the graduate school of business there. And that's when I started to have this kind of perch where I was thinking about my own experiences as a leader and CEO, my observations as an investor. And then I was thrust into this role where I was an instructor and teacher, where I was forced to sort of jump up, move up above and kind of look down and say, okay, well, what are the concepts that make and differentiate good leaders from not so good leaders? And over the course of that, being an instructor at Stanford on the faculty, I came to identify that the real biggest differentiator among the successes and the failures in business was really around execution. It wasn't because someone had a red cape or had X-ray vision or that they had seen something that no one else could see. They were just really much better at getting things done. And that's what sort of led to my whole philosophy about management, and of course led to the book, The Manager's Handbook, which you'd referenced earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that it's super practical. I run a couple of CEO mastermind groups. I actually have 3 full-time groups. And I've got a number of certified chairs that run groups with this format. But I brought your book up the last couple of days because I had 2 groups and they all downloaded it. So you got a few sales on that. But it was fantastic in how practical it is. It wasn't, here's this theory and how you think about it and run at it. And I find it interesting that you teach how do you see tactical execution. And one of the things that I always say when people finish their strategy is, congratulations, you're 3% of the way there. Now 97% is actually doing all this stuff that we talked about. Why do you think it is that leaders get so excited about and energized around creating strategy, but have way less energy for execution?
Well, to reference the first part of what you were saying about the book being practical, and then I'll get specifically to your question. I was really glad you said that, Lee, because I didn't want to write a beach read, like a business beach read, or certainly nothing that was a biography on me at all. I told my wife, I said, I want to write a book that people use, not that they read. And that's why each chapter is written in as few words as possible. Each chapter, as you know, Lee, has a summary of the notes, so you don't have to take notes. So if you read a chapter and then you come back to it, let's say you read a chapter on how to give good performance feedback, you don't have to reread the chapter. You just go look at the back of the chapter and read it. So it was all meant to be, and that's why I called it a handbook. It was all meant to be something that you would use, that you would keep on your desk. So that's about the practicality of it. The second part of your question, which was, now I forgot. Sorry, Lee.
No, leaders get excited about
Oh,
creating
yeah. About strategy.
way less
Yeah.
execution. Yeah.
Totally. Because it's easier, right? I mean, the way I mention it in the book, and the way I think about it is, it's a little bit like, I want to win the Super Bowl, but I don't want to do the push-ups. And a lot of good execution is about doing the push-ups, being in the weight room. And so some people say, I want to cut corners. I think I can like big picture my way, or, think my way over this problem. And that's just not how it really works in the real world. So it's about taking shortcuts. Now, people will sometimes say, oh, well, what about Jeff Bezos and Amazon? I say, well, interestingly enough, Amazon was started about 4 or 5 years after all of the plumbing was established for online retailing. So he didn't invent online retailing, and he certainly didn't invent the technology behind online retailing. He was not the first person to sell books online. That was called Books Galore. And right after he launched, within a matter of months, Walden Books, Border Books, and Barnes and Noble all also started selling books online. So if you set that up and I described that to you going back in time, you'd say, this guy's going to get annihilated, right? He's got no strategic advantage. He's got a higher cost of goods, etc. But I know from people who worked at Amazon, and also my own research for the book, is that what they did is they just basically out executed everybody. Same thing with Apple Computer. I mean, they didn't invent the smartwatch. They didn't invent the iPad. They didn't invent portable music. They didn't invent the PC. Steve Jobs was relentless about the day-to-day execution. But people don't want to read a book about that. They want to read a book about someone that they think is Superman and has a red cape, as I said before, and can leap over tall buildings with a single bound. That's fun to write about, or to read about. Reading a book about how good Jeff Bezos was at running a meeting. Some people think, oh, that's ho-hum. Well, that's what the manager's handbook was all about, is I describe how at Amazon, they run better meetings. They still to this day do, which is why they win, or why Apple Computer is much better at setting and adhering priorities than any other company out there, which is why they win. So Lee, it's about this desire to not do the push-ups, to take the shortcuts, which, by the way, you could go, oh man, I don't want to do push-ups. That'd be one way to think about it. But another way to think about it would be, wow, in a competitive marketplace, most people aren't willing to do this. If I'm just willing to do the push-ups, I can run past everybody, which is what the best executors do.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I also think there's another big piece here where a lot of leaders don't even understand what it takes to execute, so they don't value it, they don't understand it. And I have a recent example of a client where I helped them hire a CEO. The company grew 1,100%. This was a big deal in about 20 months. And they didn't want to pay the bonus that came with that, because it was a preset percentage. And so the whole relationship blew up. And the founders of this business didn't appreciate or even understand what it took to get there. They just thought this should just happen. It's common sense. Why do we have to do all of this stuff? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a big piece there where it's not that they don't want to do the push-ups. They don't understand the value of doing the push-ups. So speak to that. Are you seeing any of what I'm describing here?
No, I absolutely agree with that. I think that, the art of execution, if you will, which is described in the book, The Manager's Handbook, is underrated. And, some people I think feel like, well, that's the ante. Of course, you got to execute. But the fact is that the difference between really good executors and average executors is massive. And that's the differentiating factor. I do a lot of speaking now on this subject, and I have a lot of data, actually, interestingly enough, to support it. And one of the things I cycle through quickly is I cycle through different industries. So, for example, I look at the airline industry, and I look at the airlines that were in existence in 1950. And then I point out to my audience that all these airlines were after the same customers. They bought the planes from the same people. They bought jet fuel from the same companies, same terminals, same airspace, everything. And then I cycle through 1950, 1960, 1970, go through. And of course, you know that there's all sorts of winners and losers during this whole period of time. And so I say, so what is the difference? Like, why does Delta Airlines still exist? And and Allegheny Airlines doesn't even exist anymore. Well, of course, it's execution. So then I go through the same thing. I look at the department store business, like Sam Walton. What did he have going for him? Okay. He was in the middle of a very small town in Arkansas, and he was competing against all of these big names, and he annihilated them all. Well, you can't say that he had some strategic vision, because he didn't invent the department stores. Just every day he out executed people, day after day after day. And so it goes. And so when I'm speaking to people at the end of this first like 15, 20 minutes of my talk, they're like, wow, I get it. I used to think that like Sam Walton could walk on water and could, but I realize now that what Sam Walton was willing to do is he was willing to do the push-ups. And as a result, if he were alive today, he'd be the richest person in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. When I think about strategy and execution, like the simplest way that I think about strategy to distill it down where a much broader audience will understand it, because sometimes you hear strategy is super heady and I'm not qualified to do it. But strategy to me in a business they're just approaches to increasing the value of the business. That's how I think about it. And I'm assuming on all the continuous improvement and execution that Sam Walton did or drove, there was a lot of strategy in there and these approaches to increasing the value of the business. And I've gone back and forth, but I've kind of landed on, I think you have to love strategy equally to how you love execution. And I've seen folks that love execution more than strategy, and they're doing lots of stuff that aren't connected and they don't create the value that they could. And then obviously strategy, they love the heady, fun conversations, but they don't want to deal with the messiness of doing it. But I think you kind of have to love both equally and just go for it. But how would you describe that or talk about that in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I might not use the word love, but I would say that both are required. Because I was, if I were to use, say with the sports analogy of push-ups, you're not going to win a game with just offense. You need offense and defense. So you need to be able to do two things at once. I reference, Bill Gates has this wonderful expression. He says, strategy without execution or vision without execution is daydreaming. Michael Porter, who, professor at Harvard University at the business school, who I think most people would say is kind of the father of modern business strategy. He was actually my mentor in writing the book. And, he had some really interesting things to say about the book, and he was very involved in how I positioned the book and so forth. And of all people, the father of strategy, Michael Porter, was probably my biggest cheerleader during the book writing process, because his point was, look, you do have to be pointed in the right direction. You have to know what direction you're pointing in, but then you've got to actually be able to march down the field. And if you're not good at execution, you can't march down the field. And when I'll tell you a quick story, Lee, about this. I'd finished the book, or so I thought. And you're supposed to write the introduction after you write the book. So I did that. And so, Mike was really familiar with the book. And so I said, would you read my introduction? So I went over to his house. We're sitting in his kitchen. I give him the introduction to the book, and he's reading through the book. Now, remember, Michael Porter, there's no one who's written more business books and sold more copies of business books in human history than Michael Porter. So it's a little intimidating to be in his kitchen.
I'm aware. Yeah. I'm a fan.
Yeah. And he reads it, and he takes the manuscript of the papers and he turns it upside down. And he says, you got it all wrong. And I was like, oh my gosh, I thought he was talking about basically that I wrote the whole book was wrong. And what he was saying was that I had positioned in my introduction, the 5 parts of execution, or the 22 steps of execution, like you could pick and choose. And he said, you're positioning this in a way that your readers are going to just do the easy stuff. They're not going to do the hard stuff. And this is what he said, which was very flattering to hear, but also really instructive, is he said, you've created a unifying theory of execution. This is what Michael Porter said. He said, just like he had created a unifying theory of strategy. And in his unifying theory of strategy, Porter's 5 forces, you can't just do 2 or 3 of them. You have to they all fit together. So here was the example. He said, how can you set and adhere to priorities if you haven't done a good job building a team and you don't have good people around you? And you don't know how to run a good meeting. And he sort of went through and he cycled through a whole bunch of the different skills in the skills of execution in the book. And you see, so he was telling me, he's saying, see how these all fit together. So your readers, when they read the book, have to say, I'm not going to just I can choose to pick and choose the easy ones, but I'm not going to win the Super Bowl that way. But if I do them all together, they fit together, and then you have magic. Then you have Amazon like magic, Apple like magic. And that works also if you've got a lumberyard in Arkansas. Right. I mean, you don't have to be trying to conquer the world like Steve Jobs. You can be running a good, solid business, but just completely outpacing all of your competitors.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's the whole thing in balance, creating value, together, the right allocation of resources, everything. But I find a lot of folks looking for the silver bullet. Just tell me the one thing. If I do this one thing, it'll fix my whole business. So I don't see that happening. Do you get students that are coming in kind of looking for the silver bullet? Give me the one thing to do, or they come in eyes wide open that this is a bigger thing that all has to happen together?
No, not at all. In fact, Lee, it's the opposite. And it's one of the reasons that I jump up and down and pound my fists, which is that, especially in Silicon Valley where Stanford is, you get fed these tales about being able to sort of have this X-ray vision, or what is the latest shiny object, and if you just grab it, whether it's crypto or online retailing, or you go down the list. I mean, every year there's something. People think, oh, if I just hop on that bandwagon, everything's going to work out. Well, the problem is that they're hopping on a bandwagon or a train that is very, very, very crowded, because it's easy to hop on and say, oh, well, if I do this, everything's going to work out. But the differentiation is execution. So no, it's quite the opposite, especially when you get into areas like Silicon Valley, where you can have the excuse that you don't need to actually do the hard stuff. However, having said that, when I go through and I cycle through the examples, whether it's a department store or Apple computer or go down the list, people lock onto it and they go, you know what? The data is irrefutable. And that's truly the case, Lee. If somebody says to me, make the case that Apple computer is where they are because of a combination of good strategy and good execution, or it was just good strategy, I can make that case so easily. It's irrefutable. And then and it goes all the way down to, like department stores. I talk about everything from Safelite Auto Glass that replaces windshields. It doesn't really matter what the industry is. When people see that, they go, oh, I get it. Then there's usually this sort of phase where they're thinking, oh, that seems kind of yucky. I don't really want to do that. And then I point out, well, guess what? That's how most people feel. It's not that hard to do if you're willing to do it, and you will annihilate and crush your competition. And then people get pretty excited. Now, there's this curve that I actually learned about after I read the book, or it would have been in the book. But I was sitting in a colleague's class at Stanford, and she flashed this curve up, and it said levels of learning, and it was fascinating. And can I just describe it really briefly, Lee?
Please, yeah, please.
Okay, so the curve starts with unconscious incompetence. Now, forgive me for those words, because the incompetence thing is gonna make sense, but it's unconscious incompetence, meaning you're doing it wrong and you don't know you're doing it wrong. So let's pick a really simple example. Let's say you're running a meeting and you go in and you run the meeting, and really the meetings are taking too long and you're not making good decisions and the right people aren't talking and so on, but you don't know any better, right? And then after a while, you're like, God dang it. It seems like we're always in a meeting and everybody's in a meeting and we're not getting anything done and we're talking about the same things over and over again. Okay, that is moving to conscious incompetence, which is like, okay, this is not working. I don't know the right way, but I know that this is not working. And then the next phase is, and so then maybe you read like the manager's handbook or something like that, right? How to run a meeting. There's a chapter on how to run a meeting, as you know. And then you go, okay, I get it. There is actually a solution to this. That becomes conscious competence, which means that now I'm running the meeting properly, but I have to be thinking about it all the time. And I have to keep reminding people, this is how we run the meeting. We do clarifying questions. We summarize at the end. Everybody's like, yeah, right. You're right. So that's conscious competence. Okay. Here's the last part. The last part is unconscious competence, which means you don't have to think about it anymore. So in my investment firm, we run meetings a certain way. We don't have to think about it because it just becomes human nature. When we give feedback to each other, we don't like think about the 6 steps that are laid out in the book, in the manager's handbook, about how to give feedback. That's just the only way we know how to give feedback. And if you want to build a really great, fast moving, enduring organization, you're taking everybody to this level of unconscious competence where you actually don't have to think hard about it. So let's just finish with this. Think about sports. Okay. Probably everybody who's listening has played some sport, whether it's, croquet or football or whatever. And we all know that there's aspects of that when we get started, we have to think consciously about it. And after a while, we don't think about it anymore. Well, the same thing is true with all the skills about business. Great running organizations, the employees are not thinking about it consciously anymore because it's just how we do things here.
Yeah. Yeah. Love that. I mean, that makes total sense. Absolutely. And I think, so on the execution side, I think a big part of strategy should be approaches to execution. And there's so many examples out there of an approach to execution that makes the complex impossible and not simplifying complexity. And there's one example from my work over the last probably 15 years where when Rob Gillette came in and took over ServiceMaster, and one of their businesses was True Green, and I was part of that discussion and what was going on. They made True Green way too complicated, and it would have 50 million positive cash flow minus 150 just bouncing everywhere. And Rob said, you know what? This is a really simple business. Show up on time, green grass, smile, and like in a weekend, put an app together and you could see the entire Eastern Seaboard lighting up green. You didn't want to be the red dot that didn't show up on time. And the next thing you know, cash flow is climbing by tens of millions of dollars a year going forward. So I think approaches, which is again a big part of what you have, the reason you wrote your book, but approaches matter. And I see a lot of operating methodologies that make process more important than what is most important. And what is most important to me is creating value, and for the CEO continually responsibly increasing the value of their business. So talk about approaches pitfalls, if you could. Like, if we're going to figure out a way to execute, how do we have a smarter way of making that happen so we're not making process more important than what is most important?
Yeah. By the way, what was it? It was smile, green grass. There was 3 of them, or was it just the 2?
Show up on time, green grass, smile.
Oh my God, that's brilliant! I got it. Right? I'm not going to forget that.
So what is that for all of our businesses too, right? What's the 3 things that we do this well, we crush the competition, to use your words?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna comment on the micro part of your question, the macro part of the question. The micro part of your question kind of relates to the issue of KPIs, or key performance indicators. And there's a chapter in the manager's handbook on how to develop those. And one of the key concepts in there is that you've got to get it down to like 1 or 2 magic numbers. And the companies that do that, and they're willing to sort of be, look, we can be minus in these other 8 things, but we are going to be A++ in these 2 or 3 areas. They're the ones that really, really excel. So that idea about, smile, show up on time, and green grass is brilliant. I talk specifically about the issue of Southwest Airlines. Now, Southwest Airlines has not had the earnings history that they, in the last half a dozen years that they had beforehand, but for decades, they were the most consistently profitable airline in the world. And that airline was basically saved and created on one number, which is the 10-minute turn, which is how quickly they can turn a plane around. That's what everybody lived and breathed it. And on the anniversary, I think it was the 50th anniversary of Southwest Airlines. Not quite sure which one, but I think it was the 50th anniversary of Southwest Airlines. They dedicated their magazine to the 10-minute turn. So this is not just sort of mythology. I mean, you think about, if you're looking back on a company in the decades of history and you dedicate it to one KPI, that's pretty powerful. So I had now the macro answer to your question is, I remember after I read the book, I was with someone, a guy named Jeremy, and we were riding along. We were on vacation together, and he runs a really large real estate business in the United States. And he asked me this question. He said, I read the book, really interesting, loved it. What companies embrace these 5 skill areas? And I thought about it. I paused for a second and I realized that I'd never thought about it the way Jeremy was positioning the question. Because what Jeremy he wasn't saying who are the leaders, who are the CEOs that do it. He was saying, what are the organizations that do it? And I wish I had had the conversation with him before I finished the book, because I would have pointed that out in the book, is that the macro answer to your question is that it's not sufficient for the CEO to read the book, for example, or I don't want to make it all about the book, but the CEO to think about execution and say, I'm going to be really good at execution, and then the rest of you guys just do whatever you want. But what I realized that the superstars were the ones that thought it's actually not that I'm going to execute well, but that's not really important. What's important is for me to be a teacher and create an organization that executes. And so now, just because we were just talking about it, it'd be a familiar example. Jeff Bezos, he didn't feel like, okay, well, I'm going to run my meetings well, and if anyone wants to, follow my role, that's fine. He said, this is how we do things at Amazon. All our meetings are run this way. Don't even dream of running a meeting a different way. It was very powerful. Other organizations will say, this is how we hire. Don't even dream of hiring a different way, because this is how we do it. And when you get the entire organization implementing whatever this, I've got the 5 skills that I identified, but whatever it is that you identify is important skills for execution. When you get everybody moving in that same direction and doing it the same way, not only you're running faster, but you get this bonus, which is you get process improvement. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you and I both hire differently. Well, we don't really have a chance to have any process improvement because we are doing our own thing. But if you and I both hire the same way, and so does everyone else in our organization, and we have someone that does exceptionally well that we hired or doesn't work out, we have a chance to do process improvement and say, oh, you know what? If we change this, we'll probably have more of this and less of this. So let's all do that. So you get the chance to have process improvement, where if everybody's running their meetings a different way, and everybody's hiring a different way, and everybody sets priorities a different way, and everybody plans out their day a different way, the organization doesn't get any process improvement either.
Yeah. I personally, I'm not a fan of everybody do your best to hire the best and then hope for the best, which is kind of what we're talking about there. And that seems to be the strategy of a lot of companies, especially really large ones, surprisingly to me.
Yeah.
And you talk in the book about frameworks and how important it is. So I've actually started 8 companies from scratch. I love being in the game. I've had exits from a few million to well into 9 figures. And I developed over a few decades something I call the MIND methodology, most important number in drivers. And I wrote a book titled Your Most Important Number that I outlined it in there. Yep. But this is all based on the company has one number that above all others represents the value of the business and drives the majority of the right behaviors. And every single team has one number that does those 2 things, reflects the value and drives the majority of the right behaviors, has to pass both tests. And you can cascade that all the way to the front line, no matter how big an organization is. And I don't think I know. This is why Jack Welch said to me, this is the best business management system I've ever seen. If I was still running GE, I would have had all 400,000 employees in here, because his challenge was, I think, how did you refer to it in one of the podcasts in the book, rank and yank or whatever. What he was trying to do is to say, look, at any point in time, there's probably 15+% of the team members that really aren't right for this culture and what we're trying to create from a value standpoint. And we should help them find a better environment. But leaders won't do it because they become friends. And I can't go micromanage this across hundreds of thousands of employees, tens of thousands of leaders. So I'm just going to force it. And he told me, the problem there is you could have teams where everybody's a star, and unfortunately we lose some stars. And you can have teams where, 60% of them shouldn't be there. It's not right for them or the company. Yep. And you keep 50% of them. So I think frameworks are really important. And sometimes you have to do things in a macro way that feel maybe a little brutal in the case of Jack Welch's example, but wow, did it create a lot more value. So speak to the power of, the power of frameworks.
Yeah.
I just gravitated towards it because that's what I discovered made sense. Naturally, I didn't learn from anybody around it, but speak to that a bit.
Yeah. When I talk about the power of frameworks in my class at Stanford, I have up on the screen just two pictures. One is a bullseye with an arrow in the bullseye, and the other is, you remember that cartoon Roadrunner? Um, yeah, and the Roadrunner. And I said, what frameworks allow you to do is to move faster and be more accurate. So, and that's where they become extraordinarily powerful. So, an example is one chapter in the first part of the book on building the team in the manager's handbook is the chapter on giving feedback. Now, I could leave you with lots of general concepts about giving feedback, and you'd probably kind of like muck around in there and get a little bit of it right, but you'd probably start to revert back to the way you used to do it or the easier ways to do it. So I just create a framework, 6 parts. And when you're giving feedback, you go A, B, C, D, E, F, just like that. That's very conversational, but there's 6 steps to it. And when you do it that way, first of all, when you're saying, okay, I need to give feedback to Margaret, and I have that 6-part framework, I can prepare for that conversation way faster. That's the Roadrunner. And then the second thing is that conversation is going to be way more impactful, and my odds of success with Margaret on giving her this feedback is going to be way higher. That's the bullseye, by using the framework. And then going back to so there it goes. So you have a framework on hiring, you have a framework on how to set and adhere to priorities. And it goes back to this sort of like how-to manual. But the whole point of it is, if you use these frameworks, it's faster and it's more accurate. And now I want to layer in what I was talking about earlier about the levels of learning. Someone might listen to this and go, "Oh man, that seems kind of cumbersome, like those 6 things I got to remember." No, maybe for a month or so, but after a while, when you follow those 6 steps for giving feedback, and you see how effective it is, and it works, and how fast it is, and how easy it is, then you don't have to think about it anymore, because you wouldn't consider giving feedback any other way. And you don't have to go back to the book and look it up. What are the 6 things? Because it's just how you do it. And that's because you've reached unconscious competence.
Yeah. And in my experience, it takes work to put these things in place, like discover what that is, and truly understand the organization and put something in place on the other side that's simple. It's the same across the board, but then it's not cumbersome. It uncovers so much capacity for everybody when we do that.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a common way of creating values in organization, the language, everything that goes in there. So I 100% see exactly what you're talking about there. So my question is, in your experience, it's so easy for a number of, I think, obvious human nature reasons, but so easy for team members to make the process what's most important. Like I ran the meeting, we did it exactly this way, this many minutes for each thing. And they lose the perspective of, we're doing this to create more value. And with that intention, it changes how we make decisions, the actions that we actually take going forward. So in your experience, love the frameworks, but how do you get them to implement the frameworks in a way to create value and not make process more important than what is most important?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. My feeling is this, though, is that if you're following a framework that allows you to not spike the ball, that you don't get it over the goal line, that you don't end up making a decision, then it's a flaw in the framework. I'll give you an example. It's a framework on how to run a meeting. Okay. And an essential part of that framework is that after each section of the meeting may have one section or may have multiple sections. You very quickly say, you're not going over the meeting, who said what. You're saying, this is what we decided. This is what is going to be done. This is who's going to do it. And this is by when. Okay. There's 4 things. It's like super simple to do, especially if you know you're going to do it at the end. That framework actually forces you to have this bias for action. Same thing with the hiring. I mean, the hiring is set on like, what are the outcomes that you want from this employee? You're not trying to hire a Stanford MBA who's got X number of years of experience, blah, blah, blah. No, you want someone who can increase sales by 15%. So if you have the right framework, the framework are actually, think about it, Lee, like these are guardrails that keep you from, having this sort of bureaucratic process that I went through all the steps and in the end, I didn't get anywhere. The framework is supposed to force you to say, this is what we decided. And another part of the meeting framework is you begin the meeting with, this is the problem we're trying to solve or the opportunity we're trying to take advantage of. Everybody understand that. Everybody nods. If you begin the meeting with that, and then you run through some steps, and at the end, you have to say, this is what we decided. This is who's going to do what by when. Boy, you are kind of in a corner. It's pretty hard not to actually have an action, on a proactive, high trajectory execution action meeting. I worded that miserably, but I think you sort of know what I'm saying.
100%. So digging in even a little bit further into this, so there'll be a framework in an organization. Let's say it's got 1,000 or more employees, and some leaders apply the framework and get amazing results, and others apply the framework and they're just sitting there. It's like everybody's hitting their goals, but we're not going anywhere. It's like how they do it. And so I'm really interested in this because there's a lot of popular operating methodologies that small and mid-sized businesses are putting in place. And some will say, wow, it changed everything for the better. And there's always more that say it didn't do anything or made it worse. And so what I've kind of come up with here is if the leaders don't understand the business model, i.e., pricing, expenses, everything that goes into that, profit, potential for future profit, they can do things that appear valuable, but if they don't fit into that, it can take the company the other way. Or what do the customers really think about the value of their products and services if they don't fully understand that? And then there's whatever strategy applies to what they're supposed to be doing in culture. But I'm finding that I think the difference is that the leaders that constantly nudge team members to make better decisions and take better actions in alignment with business model, strategy, culture, the actual value of your products and services, so they can continually improve those things appropriate, for their job. Those are the ones that make it, and the ones that don't nudge in those directions, they can start making process more important than what is most important. This is what I've discovered, and it's kind of fun coaching around the nudging piece of it, however you want to call it coaching, but I call it value creation nudging. How does that land on you, and how does that fit with the work you're doing? This seems to be a giant deal in the work that I'm doing.
Yeah. As you were describing the situation, Lee, I couldn't help but think about different people that I've worked with. And, one of the things that was sort of cycling through is there are people out there who have a bias for action. And there are people out there who, they're kind of ready, aim. And of course, there's a balance. You need to make sure that you aim before you pull the trigger, so to speak. I don't know if I'm not sure there's a solution to that in a book. I think you can get coached into it. And I've definitely had people that CEOs that I've worked with that I've been on the board of, who I've had to take from sort of a, let's say a consultant mentality or working for a big company and all the things that got them into business school at Harvard or Stanford or someplace like that. And saying that the CEO or the manager of a division, they have to have this bias for action. But some of that, I think, I might be wrongly, but some of that I think is kind of inherent in you. That's part of being the right athlete. The frameworks or the tools, maybe a way to think about it is this. Let's say that this may be an indelicate way to put this, but let's say that you have an incredible athlete and someone who's just not very athletic, they're uncoordinated, and you give them each a great golf club, Well, the athlete is going to do wonders with that great golf club. The other person may not. So it could be, and I'm just exploring this with you, Lee, while we're chatting. It could be that some of these frameworks and tools, they have to be in the hands of someone who does have this kind of like inherent bias for action that they want to see, they want to move forward. And you can hand the book or the golf club or however you want to word it to someone who doesn't have that bias for action, and they'll almost like abuse the framework. Having said that, and now I am going to confess that I am clearly talking out of both sides of my mouth. I do want to knit that to what I was saying earlier, which is I still believe, though, that good, proper frameworks make it very hard for you to not for you to be in the bureaucracy, be mucked into the process. And I do know that there are some of those kind of like business processes out there that you can pay for or buy or whatever, or read about. And I absolutely have experience with observing them. I'm like, come on, like how often do you need to have this quarterly meeting to talk about these things and put all these shapes and colors and stuff into these boxes? Just show up on time, smile, and make the grass green,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I've experienced a lot of folks that have a bias for action, but they don't create the value they could because they're not aligned to what the end goal really is. And it goes back to, again, improving the business
strategy,
model.
right? Yeah.
The strategy and value of what we have and all of it. And listening to you, and I think a big part of the framework can be, here's how we do stuff. This is how we intentionally create value. And in that framework is all leaders need to understand how their job impacts the business model. They need to understand the business model and how they can improve it appropriately. Same thing around products and services, implementing approaches to increasing the value of the business, i.e. strategy, and then culture. What are the attitudes and behaviors that cause the most value to be created in this organization? So they need to fully understand those things in the framework as they apply whatever the business management operating methodology is to intentionally create value as a broader team. So I think that just probably needs to be a bolted on, really important part of the framework. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the word culture, which hasn't come up a lot in our conversation yet. But Peter Drucker, who's kind of known as sort of the the first business coach, if you will, he had that famous expression that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And then, of course, I spent a lot of time with Michael Porter, who would not agree. And then you've got execution, and you have to have all three, going back to what you were saying, Lee, earlier. And I think anyone who comes on your show or stands up and says it's all about culture, no, it's not. You cannot sort of have ping pong tables and espresso coffee and win. Okay. I mean, you need more than culture, but you need culture. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Strategy, necessary, but not sufficient. Execution, which is sort of like what gets me excited in the morning, necessary, but not sufficient. You put it together, you've got culture, you've hired for cultures, you've got the right people in place through strategy, you've figured out where we're going to run to, and execution is allowing them to run. You pull those three things together, you got something really special going on. And I have, as you have, talking about True Green and so forth. We talk about on a show like this, we talk about larger companies because everybody knows the name of Apple Computer or Delta Airlines or something like that. So it makes sense. But these things absolutely apply whether you've got, so my wife has a bookstore and she's got about 20 employees. All of this just applies exactly the same way. And she and I were having a conversation yesterday about someone who, was not a cultural fit. So, it doesn't matter whether you've got, 10 people in a bookstore or you're selling donuts or you're selling airplanes. These three concepts come together no matter what.
No, I agree. And anybody that says, culture is the thing, and if you do that, it's going to be great. This is the most important thing. They're basically promoting, the silver bullet, right, or magic pill to make it. No way, it's all got to be in balance. And one of the companies that I built was in aerospace. We were in 60 countries, 2,000 customers. Southwest Airline was a great customer of ours. All the big people and package movers on the planet were our clients, as well as the larger helicopter commercial operators were clients. And all of this stuff mattered, and it all had to be in balance, because I was constantly looking at, do we have the ideal structure to create the value we want within the structure, every function, intentionally designing roles so we have clear outcomes that they own, capabilities to achieve the outcomes becomes their training program, a list of duties they have to check off as just part of the deal. But for every single role, allocation of resources, locations, all of that, and they all understood that we're creating value together. And one of these balloons could drop to a level that took the entire company down, or one floated higher than it should, and it hurt the company as well. One could take the company out around safety. So it's all of that stuff. And you touched on it before, employee reviews, performance management, 360 reviews, that kind of stuff. I've always been a believer that every team member should know exactly what's expected and where they stand on the performance 100% of the time. So when I did it, I went right past 360 reviews and all of that, and I go to performance snapshots. We know exactly where you're at. Now let's have a discussion of how we can cultivate your capabilities to create even more value for yourself, your family, the organization, our customers.
Yeah, I listened to your podcast on performance snapshots. I thought it was brilliant. I really loved it. I thought it was greatly.
Yeah, thank you. And talk about your experience there. I mean, where did they get it wrong, or what are the opportunities to make that right?
In the chapter, so there basically, well, not basically, there are two chapters on this subject. One is how to give what I called instant performance feedback, which I think complements your theory about performance snapshot quite well. That's the day-to-day feedback that you give, and the essence of it is that most people don't give feedback in a way that's clear and direct, and we do it because we're indulging ourselves. But we don't realize that that's selfish, and that's actually not caring. So talk a little bit about the concept of radical candor, which is a brilliant framework, which I did not come up with. Kim Scott came up with it. Radical candor. I explain it in a couple of pages. She's got a whole book on it, but it basically says that most people hang out in the quadrant, which is ruinous empathy, which is that we don't really say how we're really feeling because we want to be liked and we don't want to upset the person. And well, that's not really caring about them. And where you really want to be is in the quadrant radical candor, which is that you speak directly and you care a lot about them. So I described the concept of radical candor, which is pretty easy. I mean, I basically described it right here on the on the podcast. It doesn't take it's brilliant, but it actually doesn't take that much to understand it. And then I describe how to implement a concept or a culture of radical candor throughout your organization, because it's one thing to understand. It's another, and anyone who reads it, they go, yeah, that makes sense. But then they go back to reverting to what they were doing before. So I say, no, if you buy into this concept, Kim Scott's concept of radical candor, here's how you can implement it step by step, like paint by numbers in your organization. And it works. So you first have to do that. That's the ante. That's like if you're building a house, that's the foundation. And then we were talking about earlier, Lee, is that, the house that fits on the foundation is this, 6 steps to giving feedback. The second part of it is, well, what happens when someone's in a different zone? Okay, this is not like, what could you have done to make the podcast more interesting or bring out more of the guests, or what could I have done better to explain myself in the podcast? That's kind of like instant performance feedback. All these little nudges to the right or left, which are essential to becoming a really good athlete, but it has nothing to do with how you're doing fundamentally. Some people are really struggling, and they're struggling in a way that if they don't change, they might lose their job. And that requires a different type of feedback because you owe it to them for them to understand it. And we all have so many stories of people who were blindsided basically when they got fired. And the boss always has some narrative that they pull together about, well, they should have known. But the fact of the matter is that they weren't straight with the person that these changes needed to happen or they were going to lose their job. And you have to be able to say that, but you say it because you care about them. And I talk about how to deliver that news in a way that the people know that you're not saying it as a threat. You're saying it because like, you can do this. I want you to do it. I need you to know how serious it is about getting it done. And that's the issue of like fundamental feedback. So those are sort of like the two modules of feedback that I don't know about you, what you think, Lee, but I think it's completely consistent with what you talk about performance snapshots.
Yeah, I think the most caring thing we can do as a leader is give people candid feedback in the spirit of, hey, we care about you. We want you to win. You were hired to create value in the organization. You agreed when you came on board that you could do it. Well, you're way below that waterline, and the organization needs it. So what can we do here? And as you probably heard in that episode that you mentioned, I like to set it up and say, these are the 2 or 3 outcomes that you own. Here's how we're going to measure it. And do you think you can hit this? This is what we need. This is why we're investing in you to create this value. And it's a fair exchange of value. Yep, can do it. Absolutely. Do you understand if it falls below this line, it won't work and the company needs it? Oh, yeah, there's something wrong with me if that doesn't happen. Well, it's not wrong with you. It's just maybe it wasn't the right fit. Great. So it could be as soon as a month or 2 or 3 months where they fall below that bottom line. And I bring them in immediately and say, thank you so much for trying. We're gonna separate ways, but let me help you find a better environment. Could be another role in this organization or another organization outside. And that conversation 9 times out of 10 goes way better than it would if the manager wasn't honest with them. And then what do some leaders say? But I care about people, so I don't want to do that. No, you're actually, I say it this way, you're being a very weak leader and you don't care about people by avoiding all that stuff. You're making it worse on everybody.
I agree completely with what you just said, Lee. And by the way, because I can't help but pay attention to it when you were describing how you might give that feedback to that person. You actually hit on all 6 of those parts in the chapter in the manager's handbook on it. So that's how closely sort of your philosophy lines up with mine. And by the way, this is important to say about the manager's handbook. This book is not about how I managed companies. I was a CEO of multiple companies. I wish I had run my companies the way this book is written. I wrote the book because I was identifying issues among my students and among companies that I was involved in. And I went out and investigated it. And you mentioned earlier 360 reviews, or let's pick a better example: exit interviews. I never did exit interviews when I was a manager. It was dumb. I should have done it. I think part of it is maybe because I was too insecure to do exit interviews, but it's important data, especially when you have a job market, a job environment like we have now, where it's full employment. I mean, you have to do a good job. So that chapter, nothing in that chapter is what I did. What I did with every single chapter is I said, okay, I've identified this skill area that is universal among winners. Then who is the very, very best handful of people at doing this? I'm going to go study them and I'm going to put it in the book. I reference a little bit about my own experience. Generally it's when I didn't do things the right way. But the book is really about how the absolute best people do these 22 things.
Yeah. Yeah. When I read it, it was so obvious that you had been there and you studied the front lines directly to come up with this stuff. And that's why I described it the last 2 days to the CEOs that I was working with, that it's spectacular and every one of your leaders should read this in your organization. So, thank you for doing it. One, and I wish we had 5 hours to go through everything I want to ask you about, but one of the things that I'm noticing is, there are those that love to operate and create value in the world. And there's those that want to do something and sell it and make a bunch of money. And there's such a difference between those, founders, CEOs, in my experience. I love operating and working with folks. It's messy. It's hard. It's struggling. I've learned to trust the struggle because as I go through these different layers, I come out even stronger and able to do that. Every company should, I think, be positioned to be worth as much as possible at every point in time because life situations change. But I see a big difference between those two mindsets, like huge difference. What does your experience tell you about that?
I do think that some people get bored with operations. My advice to those people are bring in someone who doesn't get bored, who's really excited about making, you know, next year 1% better than the prior year, if you will. Um, so don't give up on your business. Don't give up on your good idea. Don't give up on your organization just because you're losing a little bit of patience with it, because there are people who are just really, really good at grinding it out. And one way I've described it to different CEOs, as I've said, especially with smaller, medium-sized companies, is that for a company that size, your role is to go in there and identify the problem, come up with a solution, personally work with the solution until it's fine tuned, and then hand it off to somebody else. Like a simple example, because we were just talking about it, could be we want to have a process on how we hire people. Well, you don't just sort of say, you go figure that out. I think a lot of times it is the penultimate leader, the CEO, who says, okay, we're going to design a hiring process. I'm going to be deeply involved in it personally, and then I'm going to hand it off. And this is how the organization works. So the first thing is that, you can be a creator and then hand it off to other people to run it day in and day out who want to like make slight improvements. The second is that the really large value creation, and of course we can always look at exceptions, but the vast majority of people who have created a lot of value, financial value, are the ones who had a good idea and built a big organization year after year after year after year. And if you start a company and you get it to a certain size and you sell it and then you pay tax on it and then you put it in cash and it sits in cash not earning, and then you start another company and you've got a risk all around that and you try it over again, that's a very, very difficult way to build wealth. And if you don't believe me, all you have to do, and this is actually, I talk about this, Lee, when I'm speaking, to groups, is that just go to the Forbes 400. Take out all the people who inherited their money and then look at how that wealth was created. And you will find very, very few exceptions to this, that they found an idea and they stuck with it and they built it brick by brick by brick. And then all of a sudden they look back after a couple of decades and they said, holy smokes, I just built a tower, but it was one brick at a time.
I love that. That's probably my biggest takeaway from the discussion that we're having. It's when they get there, it wasn't, they didn't start out, this is just going to happen. I'm going to be there. It happens over time. And that's a completely different mindset. And I really, really value that. In this discussion, what was your biggest takeaway?
I think my biggest takeaway was, first of all, you gave me some really great examples, which I'm going to be using probably before the end of the day. I would say that, and also it was interesting to have a discussion with you, Lee, because you've been involved in some very large companies across lots of different industries, and to see how these concepts or this unifying theory of execution, how it applies over and over and over again. And we didn't have any part of the discussion, Lee, where you said, well, that's fine, but David, that doesn't really apply in the aerospace industry, or that doesn't apply here. What the discussion kept being is exactly, and here's where it applies here, and here's where it applies there. So I think it was affirming for me once again that the concepts of execution and what we have in the manager's handbook and what you and I have been talking about are sort of universal. The second thing is that I really loved our discussion, Lee, about the bringing together strategy and culture and execution and how those fit together, and that it's a mistake. I think, what you and I sort of ended up discussing is how it's a mistake to pull one out and sort of rank them or say one is more important than the other. So those would be my two big takeaways.
Yeah. And I mean, to add to that, and my takeaway, I don't personally believe from a management or leadership standpoint, there's been anything new in all of recorded history, but how it's packaged can be new. And I love how you packaged it in your book. And I think we can keep making it more powerful and effective by how we package these things. But there's nothing new. And most of my stuff, I just reinvented the wheel because I wasn't smart enough to have mentors, as I probably should have had. But whatever, it worked out. But I think we all come to the same conclusion. And when I met Jack Welch for the first time, I went to a management course and we hit it off. Big story there, I think. And then I go to 3 more of the exact same course. He goes, "Why do you keep coming back?" And I said, "Well, because it's the same stuff." And I said, my questions get better. I actually leave and go
Oh,
apply it, and
wow.
my
That's
questions
great.
get better and better and better. And that's why we became business partners and really good friends. So it's nothing new, but how it's packaged. And if we're all trying to create value and we're applying common sense, math, logic, facts, reason, we're going to go down the exact same road. And that's what I told Jack. It's like, he asked me, "Well, how did you do this? I've been doing this, thousands of times. Nobody's ever gotten it right till you." And I said, "Well, because I'm focused on value and I'm not letting, any political influences or any other, things get in the way of creating value. So you're obviously way bigger scale, but for me, we're doing the same thing. We're going down the same road." And so that's what I'm getting from this conversation
Fantastic.
with you. We're all going down exactly the same road, discovering the same things and making it more powerful. So thank you so much, David, for being here. This has been fantastic.
No, I loved it. And the time just flew by. When you started to wind it up, I looked at the clock. I said, "Oh my gosh, an hour's gone by." So I learned a lot. It was fascinating. It's always nice to get to know new people and hear your stories. And of course, this was a great excuse for me to listen to more of your podcasts, which are great.
Thank you so much. And I hope we can stay in touch. And if you could see the screen behind what I'm looking at here on this computer, there's probably 14 other topics we weren't able to get to. But I loved where it went. This was fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much again for being here. And this has been the Show Your Value podcast, where we explore the art of value creation. If you got some value out of today's episode, please subscribe, like, and leave a review. And until next time, show the world your value.